When Clint Eastwood walked into a small, struggling toy shop, nobody paid him any mind. Just another customer, just another quiet day. But when he stopped in front of the counter, studying the shelves with an unreadable expression, everything changed. Because the girl behind that counter, 14-year-old Emily Carter, wasn't just selling toys. She was selling her childhood to afford the chemo that could save her life. And what happened next became a Hollywood legend. Because in true Clint Eastwood style, he didn't just buy a toy, he changed her future forever. It was a familiar scent, the old paper and polished wood filling the small shop, mingling with the faint, nostalgic aroma of well-loved stuffed animals. Emily Carter ran her fingers over a row of vintage dolls, their glassy eyes staring back at her as if they, too, understood what was coming. Emily's toy chest had been part of her family for decades. Her grandfather had opened it when he was young, filling the shelves with toys that had once belonged to him, then to Emily's mother, and eventually to Emily herself. Every doll, every puzzle, every action figure, it wasn't just merchandise, it was memory. And now, she might have to sell it all. The doctor's words still echoed in her mind. Leukemia, the kind that needed aggressive treatment, the kind that came with an impossible price tag. Her parents had done everything they could. Her dad took extra shifts at the auto shop, grease permanently staining his hands. Her mom, once a full-time homemaker, now worked late nights at a diner, exhaustion heavy in her voice whenever she tucked Emily in. But it wasn't enough. Last night, Emily had overheard them talking in hushed whispers at the kitchen table. The next round of chemo? It was out of reach. The savings were gone. Insurance barely covered half. There was no miracle coming. Emily wasn't the kind of girl who waited for miracles anyway. She had made up her mind before her parents even woke up the next morning. If they couldn't afford to save her, she'd find a way to save herself. And the answer was right in front of her. She looked around at the shelves, the cabinets filled with toys, each one carrying a price tag that suddenly felt like a lifeline. She thought of her childhood afternoons spent playing behind the counter, of customers who had once walked in looking for a gift but left with a story. Now, this store had to be her story. Taking a deep breath, Emily grabbed a thick black marker, walked to the front window, and pressed the sign against the glass. "Toys for sale. Help me pay for chemo." The letters stood bold and firm. She wasn't just selling toys. She was fighting for her life. The first morning, Emily sat behind the register, waiting. The sign was there, bold, impossible to miss, yet the sidewalk outside remained the same. People passed by, glancing briefly before moving on. No one came inside. Her fingers drummed against the countertop. Was this a mistake? Then, the bell above the door jingled. A woman in a navy blue coat stepped inside, her eyes flicking toward the sign. She hesitated, then approached the nearest shelf. Her fingers brushed against a stuffed rabbit, its ears floppy, its fur worn down from years of love. "How much for this one?" the woman asked. Emily swallowed. $10. The woman pulled out a 20. "Keep the change." It was just 10 extra dollars, a small gesture. But for Emily, it was everything. The second sale came an hour later. A young man bought a vintage board game, his gaze lingering a second too long on the sign before he paid. He didn't say much, but the way he nodded at her before leaving said, "Enough." By the afternoon, a few more customers trickled in, some curious, some hesitant, others offering sad smiles that Emily had already learned to ignore. She didn't want pity, she wanted buyers. But not everyone was kind. An older man, balding and impatient, scoffed as he picked up a rare action figure. "You should be at home resting," he muttered, "not running a business." Emily clenched her jaw. "I don't have time to rest." The man shrugged and put the toy back without buying it. Emily exhaled sharply, pushing away the sting of frustration. She knew not everyone would understand. That night, after locking up the shop, she posted an ad online listing her rarest toys for sale. Maybe if she reached more people, she'd have a better chance. She had no idea that a local journalist had walked past her store earlier that day, that they had snapped a photo of the sign, the store, and her sitting behind the counter, fighting a battle bigger than anyone could see. And by morning, that photo would be everywhere. Emily wiped her hands on her jeans, forcing a smile as the older woman at the counter handed her a $10 bill. "You're a brave girl," the woman said, tucking the stuffed bear into her tote bag. Then her gaze flicked to Emily's pale face, to the slight tremor in her hands. "But, sweetheart, you should be resting, not working yourself to the bone." Emily swallowed hard, already tired of hearing those words. "I don't have time to rest," she said simply. The woman hesitated, like she wanted to say more. Instead, she nodded, squeezed Emily's hand, and walked out the door. Emily exhaled slowly, pressing her palms against the glass counter. Rest wouldn't pay for Chemo. Rest wouldn't save her. The bell jingled again. A man in a wrinkled windbreaker stepped inside, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. His eyes darted around the shop, scanning the shelves with the sharp gaze of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. Emily straightened. She recognized the type, a collector. He walked straight to the back, stopping in front of the glass case where Emily kept the rarest pieces, first edition action figures, antique dolls, the toys she had promised herself she wouldn't sell unless it was a last resort. The man tapped the glass. "How much for this one?" Emily stepped forward, glancing at the original 1977 Star Wars figure, still sealed in its packaging. "200?" The man scoffed. "I'll give you 20. Emily's stomach twisted. That toy's worth 10 times that. The man shrugged, leaning on the counter. "Yeah, but I'm paying cash. Quick sale." His eyes flicked to the sign in the window. "Look, kid, I know you need money. I'm doing you a favor." Emily's fingers curled into fists. She needed the cash, desperately, but she wasn't about to let someone take advantage of her situation. "No deal," she said firmly. The man narrowed his eyes. "Suit yourself," he muttered, shoving his hands back into his pockets and walking out the door. Emily sagged against the counter, exhaustion pressing down on her. She wasn't giving up, but with sales still too slow, she could feel hope slipping through her fingers. Emily barely heard the bell above the door anymore. She moved on autopilot, ringing up sales, packaging toys, forcing a smile with every transaction. But it wasn't enough. She still wasn't making nearly enough to cover the hospital bills. And then, everything changed. She was restocking shelves when Lucas burst through the door, practically tripping over himself. "Emily!" he panted, waving his phone like it was a winning lottery ticket. "Check this out." Emily frowned, setting down a box of puzzles. "Lucas, I'm kind of busy." "Not anymore," he interrupted, shoving the phone in her face. She blinked. On the screen was an article from the local news website, and right there at the top was a photo of her sitting behind the counter, her store sign bold and clear in the background. Her stomach flipped. The headline read, "Teen girl sells childhood toys to pay for chemo, and she refuses to give up." Emily's mouth went dry. Where did this come from? "Some journalist wrote about you," Lucas said, practically vibrating with excitement, "and it's blowing up, like really blowing up." Emily grabbed the phone and scrolled. The article had already been shared thousands of times. Then, her shop's phone rang. She hesitated before picking up. Emily's toy chest. A voice crackled through the line. "Hi, I just saw the article about you. I live in Texas, but I'd love to buy something from your store. Do you ship?" Emily's heart pounded. Yes, I do." "Great, I'll take that vintage Barbie on your website." The call ended. Emily barely had time to process it before another notification popped up. Then another. Then another. Orders started flooding in. People were emailing, messaging from different states, even different countries. Some bought toys. Others just wanted to help. Lucas grabbed a roll of packing tape. "Looks like we've got work to do." Emily barely breathed as she scribbled handwritten thank you notes for each package, packing them with the care of someone who understood what every sale meant. For the first time in weeks, she felt like she might actually have a chance. But what she didn't know was that her story had just reached Hollywood. The coffee shop was quiet, except for the soft hum of conversation and the occasional clatter of cups being set down. Clint Eastwood sat at his usual corner table, flipping through news articles on his tablet, barely paying attention. Most stories these days didn't interest him. Too much noise, too little heart. Then, something caught his eye. A headline buried beneath the usual Hollywood gossip and political debates. "Teen girl sells childhood toys to afford cancer treatment." Clint frowned, tapping the article. The screen shifted, revealing a photo of a young girl sitting behind the counter of a small, cluttered toy store. Her short, pale frame looked too fragile for someone so young, but there was something in her expression, a quiet kind of determination, the kind that only comes from fighting battles no kid should have to fight. He read the article in silence. Her name was Emily Carter, 14 years old, diagnosed with leukemia. Instead of asking for charity, she was selling off every piece of her childhood to pay for chemo. Clint leaned back in his chair, setting his tablet down. Something about her reminded him of himself. The nights he spent sleeping in his car before he made it in Hollywood, the days working brutal jobs just to keep food on the table, the feeling of scraping by, of knowing you had no choice but to fight for your future. He exhaled slowly, running a hand over his chin. This kid, she wasn't just selling toys, she was selling pieces of her life to survive. Clint's jaw tightened. He picked up his phone. The call was answered on the second ring. "Hey," he said, his voice low and steady. "I need you to find someone for me." A pause. "Who?" "Emily Carter," Clint said. "Find her number. I've got an idea." The store was quiet except for the steady sound of packing tape being torn and boxes being stacked. Emily was exhausted. She had been working late, fulfilling orders from all over the country, her arms sore from wrapping packages, her hands aching from writing thank you notes. But she didn't care. Every toy that left the store meant she was one step closer. The bell above the door jingled. Another customer. Emily didn't even look up. "I'll be right with you," she called, finishing up an address label. Then a voice, a deep, gravelly voice. "Got anything good in stock?" Emily froze. Something about that voice sent a chill down her spine. Not fear, but recognition. Slowly, she looked up. Her breath caught in her throat. Standing in the doorway, wearing a black leather jacket, rugged jeans, and that unmistakable stare, was Clint. Freaking Eastwood. Her mouth went dry. The silence stretched between them. Clint took a slow step forward, his piercing blue eyes scanning the shop, taking in the shelves lined with toys, the carefully labeled packages on the counter. He picked up a small vintage car, turning it over in his hands. Then, with a smirk, he looked straight at her. "So, kid," he said, "you running this whole place by yourself?" Emily swallowed hard, trying to find her voice. Yeah," she stammered. "I mean, my parents help, but yeah." Clint nodded, setting the toy back down. "That's real grit." Emily couldn't breathe. Clint Eastwood, the legend, the cowboy, the man who had defined toughness itself, was standing in her store, talking to her like she was someone worth noticing. She didn't know what was happening, but something told her this night was about to change everything. Clint Eastwood moved slowly through the shop, his sharp eyes scanning the shelves like he was searching for something long lost. Emily barely breathed as she watched him. This wasn't just any customer. This was Clint freaking Eastwood. He walked past a display of old board games, ran his fingers over a stack of vintage comic books, then stopped in front of the glass case near the counter, the one where Emily kept her most valuable collectibles. Inside, neatly positioned under a bright light, sat a rare cowboy action figure, from the 1960s, still sealed in its original packaging. Emily had always loved that piece. It had belonged to her grandfather, passed down to her as part of the store's legacy. She had hesitated to list it for sale, but with the chemo bills looming over her, she knew she couldn't afford sentimentality. Clint tapped the glass lightly with his knuckle. "That's a fine-looking cowboy," he murmured. Emily swallowed. "Yeah, it's one of the rarest ones left from that line." Clint's gaze didn't waver. "How much?" Her throat went dry. $100? For a long moment, Clint didn't react. Then the corner of his mouth lifted into that signature smirk. "That's a good deal," he said, "but I think it's worth more." Emily blinked, confused. "Huh?" Before she could process what was happening, Clint reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a checkbook. Emily's breath hitched. He flipped it open, scribbled something down with slow, deliberate strokes, then tore the check from the book. Turning to her, he held it out. Emily stared at it, her hands trembling as she reached forward. The paper was warm from his grip, the ink fresh. Then she saw the number, not $100, not $1,000, $50,000. Her knees almost buckled. She looked up at him, her heart pounding. I don't understand," she whispered. Clint simply shrugged, his smirk never fading. "Figured that cowboy was worth a little extra," he said. Emily couldn't move, couldn't speak, because in one single moment her entire world had just changed. The store was dead silent. A woman browsing in the corner gasped. A young boy clutching a teddy bear stared with wide eyes. Even Lucas, who had just walked in from the back room, dropped the stack of boxes he was carrying. Everyone had seen it. Everyone had seen Clint Eastwood casually hand Emily Carter a check for $50,000. Emily's fingers tightened around the paper, her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. I can't take this," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. Clint didn't move. "It's not charity," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm just buying a toy from a kid who doesn't back down." Emily swallowed hard, tears burning the back of her eyes. All the long nights, the exhaustion, the fear of not making it, it all came crashing into her at once. She had fought so hard, but she had never expected this. The bystander closest to the counter had his phone raised, camera rolling. The whole thing had been caught on video, the moment Clint Eastwood stepped into a struggling toy store and changed a girl's life. And within hours, that video was everywhere. It started small, one post on social media, then another. Within minutes, thousands of people were sharing it. Within hours, millions were watching. The headline spread like wildfire. Hollywood legend Clint Eastwood walks into a toy store. What he does next will leave you speechless. Emily's phone buzzed relentlessly. Her inbox flooded. People weren't just watching the moment unfold. They wanted to be a part of it. Orders poured in. Customers from all over the world wanted to buy toys, support the store, help Emily fight. Her story had gone from a small local article to something unstoppable. And as she stood there, still holding that check, still processing what had just happened, she knew one thing for sure. This was only the beginning. Emily barely had time to process what had happened before her world exploded. The video of Clint Eastwood handing her that check had gone viral overnight. By the next morning, her phone was buzzing non-stop. Messages, emails, notifications, more than she had ever seen in her life. Lucas ran into the store, panting. "Emily, check your website!" She grabbed her laptop and clicked. Her online shop, which had barely made sales before, was flooded with orders. Collectors wanted vintage toys. Parents wanted gifts for their kids. Strangers, people from different states, different countries, just wanted to support her. "Look at this," Lucas said, spinning his phone around. Emily's eyes widened. Her GoFundMe page had skyrocketed overnight, thousands of donations pouring in. People weren't just buying toys. They were sending money just to help her survive. Her hands trembled as she read the comments. "Saw your story. Sending love from Canada. Keep fighting, Emily. Just lost my dad to cancer. You're an inspiration. Stay strong. Bought a toy for my nephew, but really, I just wanted to be part of something this incredible. Emily pressed a hand over her mouth. This wasn't just about her anymore. Her story had turned into something bigger. The toy store, once struggling to survive, was busier than ever. Customers lined up outside the door, waiting for a chance to shop, to meet the girl who had captured the world's heart. And then, just when Emily thought things couldn't get crazier, one last surprise arrived. A black SUV pulled up outside the store. Lucas peeked through the blinds. Emily, you might want to see this." A man in a suit stepped out, holding an envelope. He walked straight into the store and up to the counter, placing it gently in front of Emily. "This is from Mr. Eastwood," he said. "He wanted to make sure you got it personally." Emily's heart nearly stopped. Clint had already changed her life. What could possibly be inside this envelope? She picked it up, her fingers trembling. She wasn't sure she was ready for whatever came next. It took Emily a full minute to gather the courage to open the envelope. The store was quiet now. Lucas, her parents, even the customers who had been browsing, all watched in silence. She carefully unfolded the letter. Her breath caught. The paper was thick, the ink bold. And at the very top, scrawled in handwritten script, was a name she would never forget. Clint Eastwood. Her hands shook as she read the words. "Emily, I've met a lot of tough people in my life, but you're one of the strongest. Keep fighting. Clint." Emily's vision blurred with tears. She pressed the letter to her chest, holding it tight, like it was the most valuable thing she'd ever owned. Because in a way, it was. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the fame. It was about someone like Clint Eastwood, someone who had fought his own battles, faced his own struggles, telling her that she was strong. She swallowed hard and looked up at her parents. "I want to frame it," she whispered. And she did. Later that night, the letter was placed in a gold-trimmed frame and hung right behind the counter of Emily's toy chest. Customers would see it, kids would read it. And every time Emily looked up, she'd remember. This wasn't just a moment. This was a legend in the making. Because for Emily Carter, this wasn't the end of her story. This was only the beginning. Want to hear more of this? Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even crazier.